All right, it's finally out. Battleborn. Randy Pitchford's been talking this game up at PAXs, I feel, since the dawn of time.
Something like that, yeah.
Gearbox Software's first new game in a little while. I guess they had the pre-sequel, came out a couple of years ago, but first sort of big game in about 4 years.
Borderlands 2 was end of 2012, so about 4 years. I mean, you're right, pre-sequel happened in between, but that was like sort of this weird in-between game that was pretty fun, but wasn't... It was just sort of an iteration on an existing game. They didn't really invent new mechanics or anything. It was just like, here's some more Borderlands as like a filler between before the next installment. So this is the first big new thing.
And they were busy, I think, publishing Homeworld as well. I think they did a couple of other little bits and bobs there. But
and Alien Isolation. And
of course,
they've done some other stuff. Yeah,
there was a lot of DLC for Borderlands.
There was a lot of
DLC.
Some of which was really good.
So those fans were satiated for a while. It's going to be interesting to see how many of them make the transition to Battleborn. So you've been playing for the past couple of weeks on the beta and stuff. Your review and progress is live on the site now?
Yeah, it went up yesterday.
Okay.
They set the review embargo yesterday, but unfortunately the servers weren't live yet. So even though the review embargo expired, we couldn't get on and play competitive multiplayer. So that's mainly what I'm doing now before I put up the full review later this week.
Cool. So I guess let's pick your brain about how you're feeling about it.
Sure.
All things considered, and hoping that the sort of online infrastructure is working fine. So right from the top, what's your take on this? You've been playing it for a good long while now.
Yeah.
What are the modes you're enjoying? I guess for people who don't know much about the game, sort of what is the meat and potatoes of Battleborn?
Yeah, so I mean, as we mentioned at the top of the show, it's a first-person shooter, as with everything with it's coming out this month. So many first-person shooters.
Yeah, we're gonna get as long as possible without mentioning the O word. We'll talk about it later on.
Yeah,
probably.
we'll get there.
Yeah.
But what's sort of the big hook for Battleborn for people who haven't been following is there are 25 playable characters, all of whom have different abilities and weapons and all this different stuff. And only a handful are really traditional shooter characters that are, hold right, left trigger to aim down sight, pull right trigger to fire. I mean, there are a lot of melee characters, a lot of support characters. There's one character whose his only real job is to run around and just heal everyone. So it's this huge variety of mechanics and play styles and gameplay loops that it's different for every single character. The thing that I discovered is if you go into a mission or into multiplayer without having read up on your character or having used your character before, you'll probably end up feeling very lost because they are so different. You won't necessarily know what you're doing, but once you figure out a character, it's generally pretty simple. The gameplay is pretty light, very fast paced, very chaotic, very much a classic run and gun kind of arcadey shooter as opposed to something that's like a little more thoughtful or cover based. There's a lot about the design that just encourages you to keep pressing forward and just run at your enemies. And every character has infinite ammo. There's no fall damage. You can sprint and reload at the same time. So it's very much about just fast-paced gameplay.
So I guess one question that's coming in a lot, Hassan mentioned here, is what's the sort of single-player component of this game? So obviously there is a large multiplayer component in that there is like competitive stuff, there's cooperative stuff. Where are we talking in terms of modes here?
Yeah. So there are 8. There's a prologue and then 8 sort of campaign missions that are very clearly designed to be played cooperatively. You can technically play them solo. Like you can...
You have to be certain characters.
Okay.
Like you can't go in as a support character and get through the missions easily.
Yeah, you just won't be able to make it through. Yeah. I mean, several of the missions involve sort of point defense sections where you'll have waves of enemies coming, you have to defend something, and if you don't have more than just yourself, you can't physically be in enough places to win. Or you'll have like bosses that can fly, and if you don't have a character with projectile attacks, you're kind of screwed until they land, and you're probably not going to survive. So yeah, I mean, the first time I beat Borderlands 2, I soloed the entire thing, and I actually really liked it, even though that game is designed to be cooperative. This game, I would really strongly recommend not playing solo. It is meant to be played with other people. It drastically changes the momentum and just sort of the fun factor even.
Yeah.
So play with other people. But yeah, so there are 8 of those types of missions that are meant to be played cooperatively. And then there's competitive multiplayer as well. So it's really just those 8 missions. That's the single player or campaign component.
How long does it take?
Each mission is anywhere from half an hour to an hour, depending on the mission. I mean, I think the longest one takes about an hour, the shortest about half an hour, and most of them land somewhere in between.
It's another reason to take people with you because the missions are very long, and if you're doing it by yourself, it can get a bit long.
It drags.
Yeah. Are we talking about sort of similar to Titanfall or something where they're not necessarily done in a linear fashion, right?
Correct.
You can kind of do them in any order.
They feel like raids. They feel like raids or strikes or something like that, where they're standalone. There are loose story elements framing what's going on, and depending on the characters that you bring in, you'll get different banter, and a lot of that's actually really well written. It may not be to everyone's taste,
right, yeah.
but if you enjoy the humor in Borderlands, there's a really strong chance you're going to enjoy the humor here, and it does give it a lot of character. I mean, this is very much like the Saturday morning cartoon of games.
Yeah.
It's light and it's funny and silly and goofy. It can be totally immature, but it's usually stupid in clever ways that's kind of fun.
One cool little touch about it too is there's 25 characters, but they all have recorded dialogue.
Right.
And it's all different. So they'll all react to, like, a lot of the missions are escort the talkie robot. And they'll all like react to the robot differently depending on who they are. I mean, you can really tell they kind of pour their heart and soul into the backstories of these characters. There's a really funny mission where you're escorting a robot who doesn't know it's going to die. And like some characters are like feel pity and some characters just don't care. It's like one of the robot characters totally relates to him. Like, it's really funny how they all act differently in the campaign.
I'm dumb as hell and thirsty for death. Oh, it's good.
It's funny. It's sort of cut every way here in the office, talking to some people. Like Mary, for instance, really enjoyed the stories in the first two Borderlands, but hasn't enjoyed the sort of the story and the dialogue in this one. It falls a little too close to a Saturday morning cartoon, I think she was saying kind of this morning. I wasn't really super into Borderlands, but there are like shades of this thing that I kind of was a little bit into. You've talked a lot about, I guess, what's sort of on offer. How does it play though? Like, how engaging is it? Is it a game you keep going back to if it wasn't something you were just reviewing?
Like I said, the variety really comes from all of the different characters. I mean, we were talking about this just before we went live. In my mind, a lot of games will give you new abilities or weapons as you play. Like, play Zelda, you get new stuff. Oh, you have the hookshot now that opens up new options for gameplay, new mechanics that you can use. This game kind of does the same thing, but each new mechanic is built into a new character.
Right.
So as you unlock new characters, you suddenly have new things you can do. So if you get sick of playing as a particular, melee character, you can switch to more of a sniper range character, and suddenly it's a completely different game. I mean, the loops are very different. There's a character, Melka, who has like this gauntlet in one hand and a automatic pistol in the other, and her loop is she needs to get up close and melee somebody so that they're like poisoned, and then her gun is more effective on them.
Okay.
So she needs to get in and then get back so that she can like swipe them but then not take too much damage. But then there are other characters who are the exact opposite, who they just need to get in and like be right in people's faces the whole time. But then there are sniper characters.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you get sick of somebody, just switch to somebody new, and that's where the variety comes from.
I think one of the biggest differences, though, as opposed to Borderlands, is that you're asked to upgrade your character every time you play.
Yes.
So your character basically starts at 0. You upgrade through, I think there's 10 initial ones, and then as you play more with that character, you actually unlock more things that you can unlock in that tree.
Very much in the style. That's probably one of the biggest like MOBA style hooks this game has.
Yes.
So that upgrade as you go is new to Borderlands style gameplay.
Yeah.
But the shooting and the floatiness and the lack of fall damage, like a lot of it will feel very familiar to people who play Borderlands. So I think, you're getting used to that character, but the actual feel of it will be familiar for people.
So obviously you've talked about there's the single player aspect, which are kind of like more linear instances or whatever. Then there is the competitive aspect, which is there's like 3 different types of modes.
Yeah, currently 3 modes.
2 of them are quite in the sort of realm of MOBA where there's creep and whatnot, and then one of them sort of a little bit different, right?
Yeah, so the mode that for me I think is going to have the most longevity, or is maybe the most interesting, is also the most MOBA inspired. It's called Incursion.
Okay.
Basically, 2 teams of 5 are trying to escort their little minions to a grinder at the other end of the level, and they have to destroy the other team's minions before they get to their grinder. It's a point battle, so whoever can successfully escort the most minions wins. So just that structure of the in-match leveling and guiding these minions and having all of these different types of characters, and so it's not necessarily symmetrical. It does end up feeling, at least structurally, a bit like a MOBA, though the gameplay is closer to like a Borderlands-y first-person shooter.
Is that fun?
Yeah, I find it really fun. I mean, it definitely allows the characters to shine a bit more. I mean, I found the enemies in the campaign to be somewhat mindless, and it's fine. I mean, you can almost think of those missions as being practice, or almost like a canvas on which you can, test out all of these different abilities that these characters have, and it's kind of just fun, and just everything that they can do is on display. But then in multiplayer, you're suddenly matched up against other heroes with equally powerful abilities and weapons. So that's when you kind of have to really dig into the nuances of the characters and find different pairings and different complementary tactics within a team.
So we'll talk to some of the negative points in a second. Goopshu asked a quick question though. Let's get it out of the way.
Sure.
Any microtransactions in this bad boy?
Not that I'm aware of. It doesn't even really seem like
there's
it's
DLC. I know that for like characters and stuff.
Yeah, and I think they are planning on doing cosmetic items, but none of that's even in the game currently. I'm not even sure how they would do that.
There's like a loot crate system for mods. The mods are almost equivalent to the shield mods in Borderlands, where like you get mods, and then as you farm crystals in various matches, you enable and activate the mods. And they actually can balance out certain characters, like certain range characters don't have much health or shields, and you can unlock mods through the loot crate system to bolster their strengths and weaknesses, and then shore up their weaknesses. So,
and to be clear, that is separate from the in-match leveling. There's sort of like 3 different levels of progression in this game, which is very confusing.
We've already dove into some of the specifics on this bad boy. Let's not get too much into
it's a very deep rabbit hole.
Let's talk to some of the shortcomings, I guess. I played a bunch this morning. I played last night as well, and was very frustrated that I had to do that tutorial mission twice, especially because you cannot skip that introductory cutscene, which is like one of the gravest like sins in game design. I'm sort of, it's a game that like I don't think I'm very much into these sort of loot shooters anyway. Like I was kind of into Borderlands a little bit, but I don't really play alongside other people that much. I prefer sort of shorter, team-based games, or like multiplayer one-on-one sort of games that like wrap up in like 10-15 minutes. So I'm not really sure if it's for me necessarily, but there was a bunch of things about this game that just did not like sit well with me. Like for instance, a lot of the game seems to be based around either standing on capture points or killing wave after wave of the same enemies over and over again. Does that get boring at all?
I mean, it absolutely can. Like I said, for me, the campaign missions are almost more like just practice. Again, if you think of them as a canvas on which these characters can paint with their wild abilities, then they're kind of more palatable. But you're totally right that it is pretty unimaginative. It's like go here, defend the thing, wave Q, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3. It's pretty routine a lot of the time. Yeah, and so you're not wrong about that. I mean, it becomes a little more dynamic in competitive multiplayer, but even that, there are only 3 modes, and really only one of those is truly sort of memorable in its structure. I mean, one of them is just a really generic capture and hold point guarding mode, which pretty standard training multiplayer, which is fine. I mean, every game kind of needs something like that, but it's hard to get excited about it, really.
What are some of the shortcomings you've sort of come across as the reviewer for this game?
I mean, the one that I think is the most obvious, and to my mind, one of the reasons this game has had a hard time getting any traction, is that there's just no real cohesion to it. It feels very scattered. I mean, it pulls from every influence imaginable, and not just even in terms of the character. I mean, obviously the characters are all very different, and you have everything from like high fantasy influence stuff to very sci-fi influence stuff. But even aside from that, look at the first 20 minutes of the game. So you mentioned that there's the mandatory sort of opening mission.
Yeah.
Just within the first 20 minutes of the game, you get this sort of like American anime rotoscoping cutscene thing.
Yeah, like Aeon Flux kind of thing.
Yeah, but then there's also
music.
Yeah, and then there's in-game cutscenes, and then there's a motion graphic, all within the first 20 minutes of the game. It's like they just said yes to every idea. And it lacks an identity, and it doesn't really kind of gel on a lot of levels.
And in terms of the gameplay as well, in that first thing, they try and do their best shot, I guess, to sort of expose you to a lot of the different mechanisms you're going to play in this game.
Yeah.
And there are so many of them, and they're so varied and disparate, and none of them seem that important, but obviously all of them are a little bit important. So you're like collecting money to buy on, putting turrets in places, and then you're, leveling up your character's abilities, which when you hit that button to view your character's abilities, it's just a wall of like so many what crazy wall of text. It's just like, obviously you can't babysit everyone, and there are certain games where like you need to like dive into that stuff and just figure it out and stop being a jerk about it. But there's something about this one, it was just like there's too much of that shit happening. I don't know.
No, I think you're exactly right. I can absolutely relate to that. And I think what almost makes that worse is that once you do figure all of that stuff out, because you can, I mean, it's, it is a pain, and you do have to read a bunch of stuff. And I recommend you do, because you'll be better off than just feeling like you're totally clueless and helpless in the middle of a match. But once you figure everything out, once you know a character's loop, you realize that it's kind of superficial. I mean, the analogy that I've been making to other people is that for a lot of games, or for something that's well designed, it's generally easy to learn and difficult to master, like Rocket League. It's immediately intuitive, but it takes a long time to get really good at aerials and stuff. I feel like this game in a lot of ways is the exact opposite,
right?
Where there's a high barrier to entry where you're just feeling confused and overwhelmed, but once you get a handle on it, it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, now I realize I'm just kind of spamming the same attack and waiting for the cooldown timer to refill. And once that does, then I trigger my special again. And then I'm just spamming the attack again. And each character has their own kind of pattern. And once you figure out that pattern,
that's it.
That's kind of all you do.
Right.
And you can switch to a new character and it kind of refreshes and becomes fun again, but only for a while. And so you can absolutely have some light fun with this, and it is crazy and frantic, but you're right that there's this weird learning curve and then it plateaus and doesn't stay fun.
Let's briefly talk about the elephant in the room. I think it's no coincidence that Blizzard decided to put the Overwatch open beta the day this game comes out.
Just savage.
Obviously trying to... these games are like... There are lots of similarities in terms that they are sort of colorful, vibrant first-person shooters which have a focus on heroes. Almost in terms of everything else, they're completely disparate games. Like Overwatch is very much a Team Fortress-inspired class shooter, and this is sort of doing its own thing, slightly more towards Paragon, and then very like broad in terms of its like single-player narrative and all these other bits and bobs. You got to say, though, as a consumer, if you're going to spend $60 on a shooter, I mean, Doom is out in a couple of weeks as well.
Yeah.
Do you think Gearbox might be a little bit worried with this one?
Oh, I mean, yes. I would assume that they are. I mean, that's some pretty stiff competition. And any month where you have, a number of high-profile AAA releases, that's already going to be worrying, I would assume, for a publisher, but especially when it's similar enough that consumers aren't necessarily going to discern between them, even if, as you pointed out, they are actually pretty different games. I would have to assume the Gearbox is a little nervous. And honestly, it seems like no one's that excited about Battleborn that I'm seeing, including Borderlands fans. And it's kind of a shame because I do think Battleborn is fun and it's doing some creative things and a lot of work and a lot of really cool ideas went into it. Even if it doesn't work out perfectly, as we were just discussing, it is kind of a shame that it's not getting at least a little more love from fans. But yeah,
it's a strange one. It kind of feels like a game that it's got all the little parts, but it just hasn't really been coming together. And when you think about how long this game might have been in development, you kind of worry that they should have probably had it down by now. But
yeah,
I could see people connecting with certain characters in the game. Like I could see a couple months down the road, if you're
a mushroom person, you probably like the mushroom dude, right?
There's some fun characters in there. I think you could have people connecting with like Phoebe or Randy or a couple characters. Like I could definitely see people. I could see it really landing with certain people and then them just loving that one character and wanting to play that one character and showing up at Comic-Con dressed as that character. Like, I think it could have, it could build an audience over time. Like, be kind of, more long tail.
Yeah.
Sleeper hit.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it needs to. It's a game that forces you to play online, right?
Yeah.
So.
It is an always online game.
Might have that same problem.
And it's also, to be fair, like I think the game's longevity has to do with its multiplayer components, and those multiplayer components were very difficult for reviewers and for people with the preview build to get a hold of. They just weren't populating the matches. So I don't know. Like there might be more of a long tail in the multiplayer. The single player seemed to come down to 3 mission types: escort the robot, hold the point with the robot,
shoot
fight
the
a boss. Yeah. So multiplayer is where it's at, and we're gonna have to see if that connects with people.
Cool. When is the review going up, Scott? Do you reckon?
I would say most likely on Thursday. That's my best guess.
All right, Godspeed. We'll let you out of here to go play that video game. Scott Butterworth, thank you so much. If anyone has any questions about the game, feel free to hit up Scott on the Twitters. Butterwomp?
At Butterwomp.
Butterwomp.
WOMP.
Love it. It's how you spell womp.